Arzu mentioned, I'm Karan, and I lead developer relations for GitHub in India. And I know Arzu mentioned and gave like a quick intro, but I'll give a quick intro as well, and then leave it to the panelists to just double click a little more to understand the panelists over here better. So first of all, we have Rajoshi, who is the co-founder at Hasura, and she'll be talking a little more about Hasura, but I want to say that it's one of the open source projects and the organizations that I've been seeing grow really well for a long while right now, and has also, I think, exactly around a year ago, announced their Series B funding as well, and is growing really, really well. So welcome, Rajoshi, and thanks for being on this panel. We also have Vishal Biyani, who is the co-founder and CTO of InfraCloud Technologies. And you can also see in his really nice, amazing background over there, two of the projects that he leads, Vision and BotCube. So he has some really interesting perspectives, being, again, a part of the open source community from various different angles, as a CTO, as a leader of a startup, and also maintaining these projects itself. Welcome, Vishal. Sorry, I don't know why I keep saying Vishal plus Vision as Vision, which actually would be really great. And then also we have Rajesh, again, really interesting because he has been, an angel investor himself, and also has co-founded a startup called Devtron Labs, which is working again on the DevOps and the Kubernetes ecosystem, and has it open source. So welcome, Rajesh, and again, welcome to you all. Glad to have you. So I want to, first of all, let you all have like 1 or 2 minutes to quickly, double click on, what you do, and probably your organization, your startup, and your company itself, to give all of the audience joining over here through various platforms a little bit more insight into yourself. So let's start off with you, Rajesh.
Thank you, Karan. Am I audible? Everybody's can hear me? Okay, perfect. So thank you for a nice introduction, and I welcome the co-panelists. I think your introduction about Rajoshi, as well as both Vishal and the companies that they're running, is amazing, because I would say out of the two panelists, relatively speaking, Devtron is a relatively newer entity in open source. We've just been 11 months technically into open source. We started our open source journey only about 11 months last year, November. And as a company, we are about 2 years old. So 2 years young, 2 years old, whichever way you look at it. So essentially what we are, as I was talking about, it's open source. We call ourselves AppOps platform. It's a term where cloud native application first approach, or in other words, we also like to call ourselves a little bit like a Heroku for Kubernetes. So essentially, ideally speaking, making the lives of the DevOps and developers easy to manage applications at scale, when they are in Kubernetes. So whether it's collaboration, debugging, whether it is about maintainability, the full life cycle of the application management on Kubernetes is what we do. I think one of the salient points, which I'm very proud of, what the team has done, is build very deep integrations into all open source projects. You name it, from a CI/CD standpoint, pretty much the entire life cycle is what we handle. Very deep integration, so that any time of the point when you start getting into integrating Devtron, for example, you don't really have to disrupt anything. You can just start and have complete integrations. And of course, it is fully hosted on GitHub, and we've been obviously using GitHub to the hilt. So this is what we are, like an AppOps approach, which is like with an essential vision of democratizing the complexities of Kubernetes, irrespective of the infra provider that you're using. We call ourselves a complete AppOps. So that would be a quick summary on what we are, how we are. Very excited for what we are building, and happy to chat further.
Great, thanks for that, Rajesh. Would love to hear from you next, Vishal.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Karan, for having me on this chat. Very excited. My name is Vishal, as Karan introduced, CTO and founder in InfraCloud Technologies. At InfraCloud, we primarily focus on cloud native computing as a space, and been helping a bunch of organizations move to Kubernetes and adopt cloud native technologies. We've been around for around four and a half years since early days of Kubernetes. And it's been an exciting journey to see the evolution of Kubernetes versus Mesos versus others and how things have evolved, from then on, basically. On the open source front, since we use quite a bit of open source as part of our work, as part of our customers' work, it's very natural to us. We have been active in the community running Kubernetes Pune meetup, but also contributing to open source projects, that we use in some or the other fashion. And out of those work and efforts, I think two ideas that we eventually kind of popped onto became open source projects. One is BotCube. It's a bot for Kubernetes, works across Slack, Microsoft Teams, Discord, Mattermost, and gives you like a debugging and operations and access management capabilities, from Kubernetes standpoint without having to give out kube config files and a bunch of stuff like that. Quite a few users across the world have been using it pretty happily. Fission is other project, which is basically a serverless framework on top of Kubernetes. It is not started by us as InfraCloud, but now we are primary contributors to it. And we've been driving and contributing to this for almost 2.5 years. It's basically a serverless kind of experience. Think of it like Lambda, but runs on top of any Kubernetes cluster. And we have some interesting use cases and users, using it in very interesting ways that we didn't imagine in the beginning, I would say. And I would be happy to chat about those.
Great, thanks, Vishal. Rajoshi, I would love to hear from you.
Thanks, Karan. Thank you for having me, and nice to meet you, Rajesh and Vishal as well. I'm Rajoshi. I'm one of the co-founders at Hasura. So we've been in the open source. Hasura launched as an open source project in 2018, and on GitHub. And we're in the data access space. So what we do is basically like when you're building applications, web, mobile, IoT, serverless APIs, and whatnot. These applications need to access data, and this data is typically stored in databases and sometimes in different services or even different third-party services like say Stripe or a CMS that you're using. So basically data is proliferated, and these application developers need to access that data. And this piece in the middle that sort of gets the data in a way that's performant and secure in the hands of the application developer is typically, it's something that it's not a particular space. There's just a lot of stuff that goes in there, including lots of different types of tools, some of your best developers, because they're handling performance and security, and a lot of code, like a lot of DIY code. So that's the space that we simplify and sort of make that data access instant in a way that you kind of point Hasura to your data sources, and you get APIs which with authorization baked in, so that you can sort of get started and build applications quickly. So that's sort of the space that we're in, and we've been open source, and that's been great. We have a great open source community that's built up over the last few years, and yeah, I think that's us, and would love to kind of dive into different topics in the course of this chat.
Great, thanks a lot, Rajoshi, Vishal, and Rajesh for that introduction. One of the first things really that comes to mind when someone is talking about open source and startups is why open source, right? Because in a lot of the initial stages, as well as probably in the scaling stage and the growth stage, a lot of them are looking at things like acquisition and growth as well, right? So maybe they are thinking about open source or not. Of course, most of them might be consuming a lot of the open source software in building their product or the service or whatever it is that they are offering, right? But very few are thinking about actually making either the whole product or core components of their product open source. So what was your motivation behind why open source and what it really means to you from a business perspective? I'd love to know, starting off with you, Vishal, since something, you worked around with Fission and BotCube, and, based on your experience in the community and also everything else. So what was your why of open source for your business and startup?
Sure. I think a lot of reason why we exist in the first place has been because of open source, be it Kubernetes, be it the other CNCF projects. So for us, it was very, very natural to give some in some form or fashion back to community, back to the larger world out there. So it was never a question of if open source. It was always a question of yes, whatever we do, whatever we innovate, we want to definitely share in some shape and form with open source. And I think open source is a great equalizer in terms of talent, in terms of ideas, in terms of disparate ideas coming in the same place and evolving over time. So for us, it was always a way to give back community and let the ideas flourish in the community.
That's interesting. Definitely one of the key things that comes to mind for many of them is about giving back to the community, because you're using something and building a product or a service on top of it, so it kind of makes sense to give back, right? So Rajesh, I'd love to know your thoughts as well on why open source, and in terms of why you think that's something that's would be helpful for you. Also, being like an early startup, what you're seeing in terms of how this is working out for you.
Sure, Karan, and I think I'll give you a little different perspective, because Devtron, being a second startup, my first startup, which I exited after running it for 7.5 years, etc., was a out and out commercial setup day one, software enterprise setup, sold millions of dollars worth of deals, etc. But I think and this is just a personal reflection as well as what we've seen, the open source as a community, as a build out of where the industry has moved, and this has blended in perspectives from building large communities. I think the whole shift has moved over the last few years, and I'm talking about various companies starting journeys of the first generation open source, second generation, and the pivot that all of us are in, right from the Red Hats, or the MuleSofts and Databricks and Elastics, etc., and how the transformation of cloud as a dissemination model is there. So there are 2 or 3 things which called out especially. I think one was the whole, of course, there's a philanthropic option of giving back. Certainly that is like an embedded option, very inclusively. But I think the important point is that how do you reach the shortest path in a more impactful manner? I think the focus is shifting from selling to adopting. So when you move from a selling to an adopting approach, I think then, and the second sub attribute is the rise of the developer in the last few years. So developer has become a very important ingredient. So I think gone are the days when you're talking about building software at scale and going to CIOs and CTOs and try and impact from there, and they may have their own ways of course, I'm not saying that they're not looking at it holistically, but I think the faster approach is virality, which is coming from how the network effects are blended into any other. So I think it's open source is more of a GTM strategy more than anything else. How do I reach hundreds and thousands of developer get go? Can I get community to bring, can I be a community product manager? We can get very inclusive feedback very quickly. And so these are 2 angles. So this is the shortcut available for you to have impact at scale, very quickly build something which could be even loved or rejected at the same time, because you're just doing fast iterations of things. So we thought that this is the best of the both worlds. The second thing which which we think is kind of important, and I think when I say the key attributes which I feel, I wear multiple hats as a business builder, being an angel investor in many companies, built another company, and now when we applied that thesis to how we wanted to build Devtron, is that let's have an impactful. Now, what are the few attributes? Market size, for example. The moment you do open source, your market size opens up because there's a vast community that you're throwing yourself open to. I think the innovation velocity with which you're actually going after things is very high, because suddenly you're open source, so technically barriers to entry is next to nothing. Your customer acquisition cost, CAC, is almost much lower than if you were a closed core company. Average selling price is lesser because in our case, Devtron, everything is open source. There are no bells and whistles, there are no paywalls. We're saying that there is no distinction between what we have today in these attributes, and then the customer lock-in is nil. You have no obligation to sort of lock us in, etc. Anytime you want to feel this is not working for you, just step out. And I think so that's the kind of unique approach that we thought, if we build and we can make a large impact, then you can always find models to innovate on the pricing. If you're adding value, you can always build pricing models around it. So I think for us, a definitive change in these shifts was very important. And overarching theme of developer is the new decision maker, given the scale of how things are moving in the digital transformation space, whether you have a tech shop of 5-7 people or a tech shop of 1,000, 1,500 or 2,000 people. I think the impact, the velocity to innovate by having an open source is the best and the most beautiful distribution model possibly. It has its own challenges, but I'm focusing largely on the positives. We can talk about the other challenges later, but these were some which really called out for us, and we thought that, hey, this is the best time to sort of democratize. We call it democratization of Kubernetes by building all of these deep integrations and just build a very nice blend of open source tech, and somebody who has built a beautiful open source project, just integrate with them. Why reinvent the wheel? Just make it fast and available. I think these were some of those things, if I was to sum up.
That was really nice, Rajesh. You touched upon a lot of those topics over there, but definitely interesting, to hear rise of the developer, and developer is a decision maker, right? Because a whole lot of the decisions in open source, as well as what actually goes in, and who contributes and how things happen, is made by a lot of the developers and a lot of the engineers these days itself, right? So those two lines that you mentioned definitely take me to Star Wars. But that's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to double click on it in a little bit while again. But moving on, Rajoshi, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. And you have, of course, seen quite a lot of success in terms of where you started off from, and then some of the pivots that you might have had, and also going on to raise institutional funding to further accelerate. And I know Hasura mentions as community is one of the core parts of the identity, right? So I'd love to hear more on why you chose to open source, and what it means, and what was the rationale behind.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think both of what like Vishal and Rajesh said like resonate a lot, right? And I think for us, it's we're building software in the critical path, right? And it's almost become a non-negotiable that critical path software is open source, right? I mean, that's kind of what Rajesh was alluding to as well. That's sort of the trend. Like that's how software is being adopted in all kinds of companies, right? We're not talking about like people who are just starting up, but in the largest of companies, in the enterprises, right? It's the easiest way to sort of put something in your stack, test it out, make sure that it checks all the boxes that you have, right? Before you talk to anybody. And that is also because it's the developer trying it out, and the developers have agency to do this. So I think because it's critical path, it was for us when we were launching Hasura, and this was the piece that I think you alluded to this. We had a larger platform which had many pieces, and we sort of took some time to try break our larger platform up into different pieces. And the Hasura GraphQL engine is the one that made sense for us to sort of like adding the most amount of value, and B, sort of having being able to sort of like make it a profitable business going forward, right? So the critical path infrastructure made like open source and non-negotiable. And I think the second question that you had is in terms of like what does being open source sort of give us, right? And I think again, these were points that have been covered very well by our other two panelists, but I'll just sort of like double click on the couple of things that specifically resonate with us. The community, it's great, right? Like there's a community forming, there's people, it kind of keeps us on our toes, because it's like quick iteration. People are like filing issues, you're looking at it, it sort of makes sure that what you're shipping high quality software continuously, right? So there's that the aspect of community and product roadmap, which are kind of intertwined, because the community is starting to use it and also sort of demanding what are the next things they want, right? And then the community again comes in, and you can see what is sort of the most required thing. So of course we have a vision in terms of how we want the product to develop, but it's the community that's using it day in and day out in sort of mission critical use cases. So the kind of insights that we get about what needs to be built is irreplaceable, right? So that's a huge part of like that of what open source sort of being open source also does for a product. And the other part is again like any kind of security sort of requirements, right? Because again, people are putting this to use, people are coming back, people, the communities, that's the giving back aspect that Vishal was talking about. And that's kind of where we're building the open source software, we're putting things out. And like, that's kind of that the giving back that the community has really helps us keep us on our toes, prioritize the stuff that the community wants. And that makes it that at the end of the day, that results in high quality software that is used and loved by developers. So yeah, that's a little bit about our experience with open source.
That's awesome. I think just summarizing, there are a few key things that all of you mentioned, right? One thing is definitely about giving back to the community, giving back to the open source ecosystem, because you're using some parts of it and then building an entire product or a service or a business around it. And second, definitely being in terms of how a lot of the developers and how a lot of the other end users to all of these open source projects are actually making some of these decisions within startups and other places in terms of where they want to kind of head to. So open source is again one of those places to kind of head towards, right? So before I just move on to the next thing that I wanted to chat about, I also want to, remind to all of the audience out here that we will be taking up Q&A as well. So if you have any questions and you're joining in on Zoom or through Facebook or anywhere else, please do drop in your questions, and we'd be happy to take them up towards a little bit end of this discussion. So of course we spoke about why open source and what it really means for your businesses, but one of the things, of course, that which I really want to kind of unpack a little bit more over here is around the sustainability aspects itself, right? Because I think all of us have seen various different projects and also organizations starting off with the intent of being open source and also having a lot of the things right, but they were not able to sustain because of the business model around it, or just because in terms of their approach itself, right? So I want you all to share a little bit more around what were the challenges that you faced initially, especially when it comes to sustainability, and on, of course, the business, the financial side, as well as on the competition side, because one of the main competitions for many of the open source projects could be the proprietary softwares, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And, starting with you, Vishal, how is it that, you see when you thought about sustainability, especially with, Fission as a project and also having, a consulting business. So what were some of those things, that you thought about or approached, or the challenges that you had to tackle?
Sure. So I think the initial period of contributing both the projects, BotQ as well as Fission, was really more of an investment from our side, and I'm glad we did that investment, right? Because of course some of the returns don't come through immediately, but you need to spend some time before you see the results. Whether in terms of user adoption, whether in terms of commercial players, looking for support and stuff like that. So definitely we had to make a case for, hey, let's invest in open source initially. I think that is one crucial decision we made, I guess. Other than that, I think you need to talk about the project enough in the community, in the ecosystem, whether it's through meetups or talks or whatever. That gives you a lot of help from the community as well, right? And I think that is very crucial. And you have to balance that between contributing to the project as well, making sure you are evangelizing it enough so that more people know about it. Those are the top two I can think of, but I'll let experience of Rajesh and Rajoshi speak more.
Sure. Definitely the key thing, of course, which you mentioned has been the decision to say that, okay, let's get into this, let's invest into this, right? So back to you, Rajoshi, in terms of this part, in terms of what were the challenges, when you're thinking about the sustainability aspects itself, when you were starting off, as well as currently. And also I'm curious to know what were the other challenges that you might have faced during an institutional fundraising as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think like given that we were starting off as a business, like we were incorporated as a company prior to our open source, prior to us even open sourcing our project, like that, making sure that this could be a viable business was obviously like something that was very core to the way we were thinking, right? So building a product so the first day zero problem was building a product that developers loved, right? So investing in your documentation and making sure people can get successful, the developer experience, these are like absolute non-negotiables because developers picking up. So that was sort of like the day zero problem to solve. But we always had this. It was not like we started out very cognizant of the fact that this needs to make sense as a business, right? And that's sort of like we had institutional backers as well, so it was something to be very mindful of. And so for us, this sort of happened in two ways. We kind of initially, like I said, were focused on the adoption, but we were always continuously looking at it. Was critical path software. You could take it, deploy it anywhere, sort of go get, and we have scores of like open source users just kind of using it, right? However, the main philosophy of Hasura is that you want to ship fast, right? You want to ship fast, you want to build fast, you want to kind of use as much sort of off the shelf software. Like Hasura functions as a service, right? It's an open source product, but it sort of ships as a Docker container and it functions as a service, right? You don't need to go in and do too much. You literally take Hasura, point it to a database, it gives you API. So the developer experience around it is very tuned to sort of getting people successful, right? And so, and given that people are buying into that philosophy of ease and like shipping software themselves, we knew that like once Hasura is in your stack, in the critical path, right? The operational ease of running Hasura, right? You don't want to manage, you put Hasura in your stack, you're running it. Now you still need to manage it. You need a team around it, right? And that's the portion that we could productize. And cloud makes a beautiful distribution. Like it's made it's sort of become like one of the best ways today to monetize open source software, right? Like just managed, it's sort of expanding the same notion of ease to say that, we'll manage it for you. You don't need to manage the software as well. So we knew that there were ways that we could monetize. In the early days, we would be we would listen to everybody and like see what people were saying, right? Like we made sure that people could reach out to us if they were running Hasura in a mission critical environment. We wanted them to talk to us, right? Whatever it is, right? And we would keep listening to those, like looking at what are the production problems that people are facing that we could productize as part of our commercial product, right? And that's kind of what we were like. We had our plans, but this was sort of what we were continuously listening. Yes, you could put a team around it and manage it, but again, like if you get it in a product format in something that is hosted, then it's again just furthering the same philosophy. So that's kind of how like we had a plan of how we were going to monetize from day one. We were listening to the community, kind of like helping us prioritize how we would roll that out. And then we rolled out our commercial products about 1.5 years after we went to, where we launched open source. And that's kind of, those hypotheses that we have played out, and that ease of like running Hasura on Hasura Cloud today is something that, is seeing traction with developers and teams, and like including like larger, including an enterprise. So that's sort of been that's kind of been our journey, where it was not like we couldn't afford for it to be an afterthought, because we were like, it was a cognizant, it was something that we started out with. So that's sort of been our journey a little bit.
Now that's interesting, because I think that also offers one of the key aspects of being open source, because you're able to quickly iterate, and your product life cycles also will be a little bit shorter, because you're getting feedback much more faster from the users, which you are able to iterate upon and then see what's working. So the validation part and the market validation part also, which would be much more faster, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So
I think just one point that I want to add is that with open source software, unlike SaaS, you're not getting emails of people, you don't know who your users are, right? And so it's like the usual like marketing, reaching out to reaching out to people who are using your freemium software don't work. So you kind of need to really be like, you need to really sort of open your doors and be like, if somebody wants to talk to us, they should be able to, like, literally, like making sure that talk to us, or just having, a Discord, making sure early team, like in the early days, making sure there was all hands on deck. If people had a problem, we were there. If people were running it in production, they could reach out to us. So that was very important, so that it's an opt-in. You're coming to us and saying you want to speak to us. But if you've reached that point in your life, you shouldn't not find us, right? And we should be responsive. So that, yes, I can trust the software, but I also can trust the people behind it, because they will respond to me. And right, I'm not putting something in my stack that if something happens, I don't know what to do. And that becomes extremely important again in enterprise, right? Where they want somebody to talk to at the end of the day, if they're running complicated, so like, critical software. So that's all that was,
right.
Part of that journey.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point as well, Rajoshi, in terms of the support aspect, because that's an entire model that many of the open source projects operate on as well, right? That the software could be, open source, or even core part of it could be open source, but just having someone talk to you and then help you out and then support you in your adoption or even kind of integration journey is what would matter. That's great. So moving on to you, Rajesh, would love to know more about you in terms of what you think is some of the sustainability aspects of open source when either startups are kind of wanting to open source components of their product or service, or even build something from the scratch itself. And also would love to know, your insights from the other side, that if you were looking at any startup that starts off as open source first, what is it that you would look for in terms of what would be the sustainability or the long-term business impact for such kind of a startup?
So I think relatively speaking, with respect to, I think Rajoshi alluded to some very interesting points. We and Vishal in his talk as well, these are insights where we as a company are relatively newer to, because 10, 11 months into open source, we are still very early into the stage of developer advocacy, building that inclusiveness, that sort of coherence with developers and the users essentially, who so obviously we're still learning that what would be a sustainable business model. But I think my hypothesis personally, and what I've been following a lot of these investable startups which actually moved into, and of course Hasura has raised a phenomenal Series B last year, etc. And the whole journey, I mean, there's so much to learn about. I think if you look at the sustainability aspect of it, and I'll talk about a little bit of a challenge as well, which I personally feel, and this is a question to panelists as well, which I thought I should ask some time later, because I keep wondering about that. But let me talk about ourselves as well. I think we wanted something very simple. We relied very heavily on debugging, for example, the aspects of application management on Kubernetes. We said that, as developers, as engineers, we use so many dev tools. There's this plethora of them, open source and closed source both. And when you look at integrating all of that, it becomes like a spaghetti of sorts. So we said, Rajoshi mentioned about the critical path. We said, can we make an OS of sorts where, or a kernel of sorts, where we just give very easy access, build a very simple UI and UX. I think that is what we focused on. Abstract the complications on that. It's almost like a low code, no code, so that, few things. For example, we focused heavily on cost, stability, and security, because we were cloud native, cloud first. We said that these three attributes, whether you look at bottom up or you look at top down, should check in when we talk about, let's say, deploying Devtron into the the mix. Now, as we see these three important parameters becomes like a core kernel of how you would like to use and use, for example, a product like Devtron for various use cases that you have. Now, from we were lucky enough, typically once people started to use us for 30 days or so, the folks came back and said that, hey, by the way, can you give us this particular feature? But since we are fully open source and there's no holds bar, everything is fully open source, so there is no There are no hidden things there. There is no freemium yet, though I'll talk about the freemium philosophy that we have as well. So he said that, hey, if you want, then you have to pay us something to get to a early expedited version of a certain release or something, certain feature that you would have, which will then also be given out to the community as we move it. So we signed up for, we have, very proud to say that 5 or 6 unicorn customers already paying us annually, which is very early validation of a monetization model that we've built. Still early days, but it gives you a lot of confidence that, hey, people are not just supporting it, they're using it, not just for design QA, but also in production, for example, which is a huge validation of how robust the software has been built and then the system has been built. Now, talking about the sustainability side of things, for example, if you wear a hat of a venture capitalist or trying to build large value, I mean, it's a typical network effect for any businesses. And the attributes that I was talking about, whether it is the market size, because the moment you start building open source, your market size, because you're just breaking it out open, technically there is no boundary. You could be sitting in Colombia or on China or in a village in India, it doesn't matter. It's the software is equilibrially available to all. Second, I talked about contributors and and maintainers, etc. I think you have incentive, everybody, and I talked about the rise of the developer, and this is a very softer aspect of the business, but nonetheless very important as we talk about tech, and that is also directly proportional to the tech talent availability, etc. We've seen those challenges, how people are struggling with the right type of talent, because suddenly what is happening here is that the developers are looking at contributions. Like developers love to say that, I've contributed in this open source project, because they want to, you have something to brag about, you have something to really, nicely write about, talk about, etc. So I think that is something very sustainable aspect of it. And then the whole market elasticity that it builds, I mean, it increases the whole elasticity aspect for many years to build, because we have seen where people have, independently valued us. And in fact, they have said, you guys have built it so, but you're so small, you were not even, I mean, we still in the midst of raising funds, early stage, we still a very early stage, doesn't matter if we've raised funds or not. You can't still compare us to the commercially open source giants who are there with the complete paraphernalia. So people have these very genuine questions that would you be able to support enterprise-wide, requests, that's all, which are very genuine requests. To me, these are valuable questions, but at the same time, you're saying that if you are actually building a community, then you're less worried about, because then people are, they like you so much, people will contribute, they will make sure that this sustains over a period of time. And I think a sum total of all of this is eventually one word, which is stickiness. I think if you have proven stickiness over a period of time, my personal feeling, and my co-panelists can obviously validate that as well, that you can build, whether it's a freemium model or whether it's a version of monetization on top of it's a support, whether it's a subscription or any variant of that. There is very, and talk about the 10 years hence, we are not even seeing, I mean, if I take a global cohort of how many people are on cloud, in next 10 years, we would have probably 60, 70, 80% of the world's businesses move completely cloud. So this is I think I somehow, like to completely belittle the TAMs and the service addressable markets that we all today see. But I think the next 10 years is going to be massively open source, massively adoption in terms of some of these technologies. So that will, I think the sustainability will be less of a challenge. The monetization would be less of the challenge, provided you have built a valuable, sticky product out there. One question that I still keep wondering about when it comes to open source and community is that this is a question which I am yet to answer, and I'm just a part of that community to answer that, is that what is the incentive, the community incentive, I still feel has not been figured out yet when it comes to contribute and maintain, etc. I think if there is more sort of succor available for the community incentivization itself, I think there will be more and more people who will be willing to contribute, even if they're working somewhere, but they want to contribute pro bono, or they just for the love of the product, they will contribute, or sometimes even join, because there is the craft has been brought to the fort of building something from the scratch, and offering instant validation, as Rajoshi was. I think you don't have to worry about, you are a developer, then you are dependent on your sales guy to sell it. There is a selling cycle in a typical SaaS company, 6 3 to 6 months to 7 months, then the feedback loop, etc., etc. This is out and open. You release it, and people dissect it then and there. So either there is love or not so love or whatever. So I think those are some of those big aspects which worked some of this, but this is yet to be seen. But I feel the stickiness and some of these developer-led, I think the whole community incentive challenge is something that I keep wondering sometimes. It's an intriguing point. But otherwise, I think early successes build the stickiness, and I think monetizable models very easily will be built, because people would love coming to you again and again. And if you build something really useful, it solves their day-to-day lives, and it solves instantly. I think the instant gratification is what another thing that, especially the developers, the nature of the developers is that, write very quickly and see very quick results. So I think if it fits into that kind of a character, people will very easily, sort of validate that and give you more sort of sustainable thumbs up to what you're building.
Those are some really interesting points, Rajesh, that you touched upon in terms of in terms of why, and also the stickiness aspects of things. I want to switch gears a little bit, from startups who are building open source softwares, and then also kind of like monetizing it, to a lot of the other startups and organizations who want to, or who are already kind of adopting open source software for their products or services, etc., or who are just evaluating some of it, right? Because of course, some of the organizations completely use open source software for building their products, platforms, or services, whereas some of them kind of still prefer proprietary software, or a mix of both, based on various different rationale and reasons, etc. So I'm curious to know what would be your advice to a lot of the CTOs or CXOs, etc., in terms of using or kind of leveraging the open source software which is out there itself for their products or services. And Vishal, I'd love to start off with you, because you're one of the technical leaders and the CTOs of your organization as well, and speak at a whole lot of different levels to developers and also the CXOs in terms of why open source for their products and services. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I had a momentary break. Was it for me, Karan?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I think if you look at the OSS innovation, right, it's not just about technology. It is also beyond technology. I think a lot of bigger organizations and other companies can learn, of course, from use of technology, definitely one, but also how to organize teams, how to make them work is something very beautifully works in open source world, right? And I think a lot of bigger companies are trying to adopt similar model with inner sourcing or similar kind of initiatives internally. So that is one thing I would definitely say. Secondly, even today, despite so much open source being there and out there, it is still hard to consume during in the bureaucracy framework of a larger organization, right? You have a legal team, you have compliance teams, you need to get all that vetted and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that will be solved by the innovations in the supply chain management, the way supply chain around software is evolving, and hopefully we can get to a point where we can almost without a human intervention validate and certify this is a great software without any CVs, or if there are CVs, we can fix them as fast as possible, right? So there's a lot of still work to be done on both fronts, I believe, on organizations adopting the principles and the way of working of teams of open source software, as well as adopting the software as it is, without having to worry or fear, am I losing something, from my company or data or whatever.
Right. So I think the gist of what you were mentioning was around the evolution and kind of ensuring that the supply chains take open source also into consideration while looking at the processes and the policies and things like that, right?
Right. Yeah, I think I hope we get to a point where we can almost use software without human interventions and slower cycles of consuming software or open source software.
Right. You also brought up a really interesting point, Vishal, which is outside of open source as a technology, open source as a culture itself, because it brings about a whole lot of things in terms of how you can collaborate and then, build a complete product or a service out in the open across with contributors who are external along with an internal team across time zones, asynchronous, and a whole lot of things itself that the open source as a culture brings along. Right. So that's again a really interesting point, that a lot of the organizations who are using or adopting a lot of these open source softwares will soon start realizing the cultural aspects of it. Rajoshi, love to hear from you. What is your advice to some of the CXOs and CTOs of startups on kind of why they need to be looking at open source for their products and services?
I think it comes down to kind of the way that we think about it is it's the rise of the developer, right? It's basically like letting developers make choices of tools that they are getting productive with. They are the ones that are closest to your consumers. They're building software, they're looking at things. So they being able to sort of like listening to your developers on what tools need to be picked. And we're seeing this already, right? We're seeing this kind of pretty universal, like globally across all kinds of companies already. So I think listening to the developers, I think that's sort of the cultural aspect that's already catching up. And I think automatically that's the cultural aspect from the perspective of the companies, right? Then developer experience becomes key, because there is software obviously which cannot be put in your stack by a single developer, right? So some products can, a single developer can start using it, multiple developers start using it in the organization just for their own work, and then the organization adopts it. That's one model, right? But there is software, and a lot, like we are in that space, which is kind of, again, that critical path software, which is like at an architectural level. So it's not like, a single developer, especially in a large organization, can come and sneak it into your stack without people knowing. But even then, like letting developers choose, so that they come to the team with high conviction. They've sort of run it in certain environments, and they come to the team because they've evaluated things. That's the other model of adoption, right? Where people kind of, when it comes to the decision makers of what goes into your stack, there are people who've kind of done that pre-evaluation, and that helps adoption. So from a management level, I think it's really about that cultural thing of letting your developers choose software, and sort of like the downstream effect of that is also having an engineering team that enjoys working at your workspace, because developers like picking tools, developers like working with software that they enjoy using, right? And so again, given the talent market and given all of that, I think that's also something that's very important for engineering leaders and whatnot to be cognizant of, that developers have choices, and developers would want to be able to use software that they like using and that they can get productive with. And it's not really that top-down sale that, hey, this is what we have decided to use, everybody use this, right? I mean, so I think those are some of the aspects of it. It is where the industry is moving. And so it's more about we need to catch up, right? It's not a choice. It will not be a choice for too much longer, right? And I think that's kind of the way that I think about adoption of open source in larger organizations.
Right. So we're coming a little bit towards the time, of the time slot. So we already do have a couple of questions coming in, but all of you to the audience, if you have any more, questions, feel free to drop it here in the Q&A section, and then we'll take it up in a couple of minutes. And I just have one last question, for all of you out here before we take up a couple of questions from the audience. Is when it comes to open source as software, or as a whole lot of collaborations and also contributions, etc. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind for a whole lot of folks is GitHub, because that's where a whole lot of open source work is happening, these days, by millions of developers with hundreds and millions of repositories out over there. So I'm curious to know how is really GitHub formed a part of your specific growth itself, and also in the way that you work with your open source community, the contributors, and the business itself. Since Rajesh would love to hear from you, since you kind of getting started in the early stages of building your startup.
No, happy to. In fact, that's why I have relatively lesser baggage, I would say, on as we've been newer to the journey of open source, and I think from a GitHub standpoint, today, for example, GitHub and open source, they go hand in hand in that sense. So I think our experience with obviously GitHub, there is no other alternative that we've even thought about or considered. But I think the more important aspect is, and this has a connection to the earlier question as well, and this is about the culture building aspect of this new, the open source charter from literally buying software or forcing software, selling software, to adopting software. So I think this whole culture of adoption is the developer first approach. Again, going back to the whole thematic ways of rise of the developer. I think GitHub is already doing a certain level, but I think if and this is the question that the new age CTOs, CXOs understand, because whether they're unicorns or not, they have seen digital first adoptions any which way. So I think in their resonance, open source or closed source, as long as it hits the key matrices, KPIs that they are running as an organization from a CXO level, is all good. I think the culture, which let's say Rajoshi talked about, giving that adoption of culture, making the developer as a key decision maker and letting that grow, because that's where your time to market, your code to consumer journey becomes shortened by using some of these tools, and open source are really important. So I think as a platform, GitHub, I think I'm talking about specifically an India-centric way. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. There should be more inclusive industry collaborations that GitHub can possibly do, where some of these, basically in generally allowing projects on GitHub, which are open source, to actually go and foster and say that, hey, by the way, this is, you can actually clearly be used by Fortune 100 type of a company. It doesn't matter whether you're banking giant or a small startup which is just valued at $10 million. The software is robust enough to be used. But I think the transition from a buyer to a Fortune 100 CTO versus a small startup is very, very sort of huge gap. So I think, again, it's a matter of advocacy. It's a matter of reinforcement that this journey and this culture is fully supported. And there's large community support behind supporting and sustaining some of these pieces of software and tools that we're building. I think more initiatives and more aspects of that cooperation and more aspects of that we would love to see. And I'm sure there'll be more adoptions, and this will bring in a ripple effect of how people will be adopting GitHub further as a platform to do a bunch of other things. I think how do you spawn more things which will have more adoption? It's a cyclical effect, essentially.
Got it. Vishal, would love to hear your thoughts. Is your audio back?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think GitHub is an exciting platform, and I think we are living in exciting times. I just tweeted, I think, a couple of months ago, one of my nephews, 10-year-old, he basically codes on his mobile device, which to me is unthinkable. And I'm just looking forward to days, where youngsters can literally code on their mobile, maybe via GitHub, ID or whatever. I don't know. That is something I'm really excited about in general. The devs and the younger generation about it. I think also other trend I have very clearly seen, which I think GitHub has been doing great at, is in-browser development. You don't need to leave your browser to neither code nor build and deploy as well, right? I think the code spaces, GitHub Actions, and the GitHub makes it like a completely nice trio, giving you a completely in-browser development. And I think, again, this is very early days of that evolution, if you ask me. I can't imagine what we will see as we will progress over time.
That's really interesting, development on the mobile. Great. Rajoshi, would love to hear your thoughts on this one.
I'll keep it short because I know we're running out of time. I think one of the ways in which, of course, we're built on GitHub and we're using GitHub from day one. But I think recently started moving our, we've started using GitHub discussions And that's been very helpful because, we used to be on Discord, and we've been on Discord for a very long time. We're still on Discord. Discord's where the community hangs out. But in terms of making sure that, certain questions that have been answered are discoverable by people, the forum aspect of it, right, which is kind of lost in sort of chat-based forums, is something that we'd been thinking about, but we did not want to introduce yet another place for our community to sort of go and do things. And given that people are already on GitHub filing issues, speaking to us, GitHub discussions made a lot of sense for us. We realized a lot of issues that were being filed were just generally questions which could be moved to discussion. So that's something that we personally really like to sort of move things between issues and discussions. That's something that we've been using. Just starting out, we're excited to sort of really invest in that for our community as well. So that's something that we've recently been using GitHub for, that we've been enjoying.
That's great. So there are quite a lot of questions coming in. So maybe we'll take a few minutes to quickly answer some of those. So one of the questions by Santosh is there like a bifurcation of what kind of software should be open source and developed in open source, and what kind should be like a closed source development? Open to any of the panelists if you want to pick it up.
Let me try and attempt. I don't think there is depends on what is the use case essentially. So I would say, based on our personal experience, some of the dev tools, especially the cloud native space, when you're actually, let's say, building your applications for cloud first type of businesses, then there are, I'm a strong proponent now of open source, and so many tools have been built. I think my question is whether, irrespective of what you're building, and I think the challenge earlier is the cost of building or buying any open closed source software versus there is so much open source availability during the initial first year, things which have been matured to a certain extent, and I would always go for selecting some of these tools as open source, as opposed to if there is a scale issue, there is something which is a huge monetizable, depending again on the use case. It's very generic to sort of say what to pick, but I think depending on the criticality of the use case that you're running, if you can afford to sort of play around with open source tools, then I would I think my first call will always be open source. So again, it's very generic to sort of think which relevant for dev tools and some of those alike technologies. Open sources would always be the first preference, and that's what my suggestion would be.
I know, Rajoshi, I think you also have a response to it. You've marked it as answering live. So any thoughts?
No, I think that was me trying to just say it's being answered live. I think.
Oh, okay.
I think we can, in the interest of time, that I think what Rajesh covered makes sense. I think it definitely, it depends on what you're building, and I don't think there's a one size fits all answer for this, and you need to sort of look at what you're doing, what you want to get out of it, and then sort of take a decision.
Got it. So I think panelists, you also have access to the Q&A. So if you want to take up any of the questions that that have been asked, feel free to. We can do that in the next couple of minutes.
Okay, so let me take a stab at it. This is Dhanshri who's asking, what is a typical turning point at which you move from an open source to a freemium paid model, other than support and building new features, also thrown around pricing models? So I think the turning point is essentially when there is, I would say that, when there is a reasonable adoption. So one is that organically there would be a reasonable adoption where you will see that the product is already being used and used to the hilt and all the features, depending on what all features have you got there. So that is clear organic way of looking at things. But the second way is that in our case, particularly from our journey point of view, the customers automatically came to you and said that, hey, by the way, we need this feature, etc., which from a product development point of view, let's say was 6 months down the line, but then you had to develop it, preempt in developing that earlier, so you could charge for that. So that brings to the freemiumness of that particular feature. Or there is, we were toying with certain features which was directly correlated with cost saving on infra side of things, cloud infra side of things. So for example, if my narrative is that, hey, by the way, using Devtron, you can save your cloud costs and total cost of operations by 30-40%. Now that's a very bold statement, 30-40% or an X percentage. Now suddenly you start to realize that, hey, by the way, can I price it with the because it's a mathematical analytic, it's not a subjectivity anymore. You're talking about 40% reduction is almost like a tangible reduction that you're talking about. Can you charge commensurate to the reduction or to the benefit that you're giving out? So can you charge it on that benefit related? So I think some of those things will come out from the use case and how customer will like it. Otherwise, I think a certain threshold, again, because this is community project, so people will talk about, hey, can I get this? Can I get that? And then you sort of prioritize that, which one, because you do run the risk of throwing up paywalls every now and then. So, and then suddenly people realize that everything we ask is behind the paywall. So we don't want to decimate that thought process. So it's a very careful choosing of what you actually keep behind freemiumness, etc., and all of that, which should be a long tail of people, clearly trying to say that. And I think the ethos of building open source initially should be to actually just get community working for some time before you could experiment, micro experiment some of these pricing led sort of features. I hope I answered that.
Yep. And just from the angle, I think on the same question, the use case that you're solving for developer are great for adopting or increasing the adoption of the product. And the features like enterprise features, maybe enterprise logging, audit logging stuff, are great for when you're kind of make it into a commercial product. Is a good segue, so to speak. I can also take the next question, which is we're building a C2C e-commerce website and app. So please guide us. How should we start leverage to build using open source, basically? I think on the e-commerce front, at least there are plenty of applications, I believe, which are open source, right from WordPress, Magento, so on and so forth. I think it's great to start with those. And you also have a lot of APIs available nowadays, for payment gateway or other stuff. That will be like a good starting point as well. I didn't understand the last part of the question, which is what are the advantages of closed source in the context of iOS? I don't think the app itself needs to be open source, but you can definitely use open source products or libraries or projects, I believe.
Great. So I think those were some of the questions that we had. I know we are a little bit over time, so I'd like to wrap this up. And for all of you attending, in case you have more further questions, feel free to reach out to the panelists, on social networks where they might be available. So thank you once again, Rajoshi, Vishal, and Rajesh for joining us here on this panel. So really interesting insights around a whole lot of things on why open source, some of the sustainability aspects of it, and also in terms of some of the ways in which you were able to grow, and how some of the other startups also can start tapping into the open source ecosystem for their startups itself. And also thanks to Headstart and the Startup September initiative for bringing across this topic to all of the startups out over there. So thanks everyone once again for joining. Back to you, Arzu.
Yes, so I would also like to thank all the panelists. It was indeed a very informative session, and I'm glad we went to the depth of it as much as we could in the given time. And thank you, Karan, for moderating the session. Thanks for joining us today. To all the participants, we have more sessions going on now. I hope to see you guys there, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.